It's time to have an honest conversation about the roster construction of the Milwaukee Bucks, and especially after watching the first two rounds of the Eastern Conference playoffs. We rip off that Band-Aid coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can hear me during the season on the Bucks Radio Network. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day each and every day. Shout out to all the everydayers out there through what is another, unfortunately, long off season. I know we mentioned this earlier in the week. Today we had planned on having more of a look back at Game 5 of that series. I think we're all ready with not doing that all too soon here. We ran into some scheduling issues with both Camille and Frank, so you just get me on the show today. And I think, as I said at the top, as we watch these playoffs, a couple of things have really stood out when you talk about where the Bucks are in the Eastern Conference. Camille and I talked about our desire to not trade Giannis and just whether or not it's what's best for Giannis or even if it's best for this franchise, just figure out a way to remain competitive, knowing full well your window for competing for a championship in all likelihood has closed for the next year, 2 years, however many more years. But looking at just how terrific Giannis was once again in the postseason, when I'm sure we've all seen it by now, people putting up Giannis's numbers and his averages through those 5 games against Indiana in the first round and how those compare to a player like Nikola Jokić and other star players that we've seen here. The big difference is the supporting cast. And I know we had these conversations during the season about which group would you take? Which team is better off? And we've had a tendency to cling to the Bucks are better off. We're in a better spot than a lot of other teams that we would compare them to because they have Giannis. And it's tough to push back against, but you start to see the way that the league has shifted more and more, how important it is to have a full team, to have a complete team. And, I said earlier in the week on, I think it was the Wednesday show, I I think the Indiana Pacers are going to win the Eastern Conference this season. And a big part of that is the team that the Indiana Pacers have assembled. There are no weak spots. And I know we have it up there as some of the things to learn from the Indiana Pacers. Well, it's really 2 routes to take here. And in both of them, you can learn from what Indiana did. One of those routes is if the Bucks do, in fact, move on from Giannis. And again, to be clear, if that happens, it is not Jon Horst or the organization deciding, you know what, it's in our best interest to trade Giannis and let's just try to get some draft picks and young players and go from there. It's Giannis recognizing what we said at the top here. I don't think I have the runway to compete for a championship here, and I would like to do that in these prime years of my career. So I'm going to need to go elsewhere to do that. If you have Giannis in tow, you still have a lot of work to do with this roster. And, even on the show yesterday, Camille and I talked about the free agents that the Bucks have and where they're currently at and ran through that entire group. Not to bore everybody with it again, but you got 4 unrestricted free agents. You have Ryan Rollins, who is a restricted free agent, and who there is definitely something there with Ryan Rollins. He's not going to break the bank. And again, with no Damian Lillard, we think for this upcoming season, there is going to be an opportunity for Ryan Rollins, for Kevin Porter Jr., if he is back here in Milwaukee, and whoever else it is, because you're going to need to have more point guard options for the Bucks. Kevin Porter Jr. is one of those 3 players the Bucks have with a player option, and then you have 3 players that have non-guaranteed deals. So that leaves you with just 4 players under contract for this upcoming season, and one of them very likely will not play. When we talk about how do you build out this roster and what are some of the changes that you make to the roster, and there's a lot of people that are kicking around Damian Lillard trades. Camille and I did it, right? In the hypothetical, well, what about this? Because the Utah Jazz and David of Locked On Jazz brought this up, what about this? Let's entertain this a little bit and see, okay, if you did that, what could you get back from Utah? But knowing full well, it is definitely going to cost you your 2031. It's probably going to cost you your 2032 pick swap. And then who knows what else, because you don't have any other assets, save for a second rounder this year and another one next year until you get to 2031. And that conversation becomes much more stark and difficult, because if you are in fact going to trade that 2031 first round pick, you have to get back not just a role player, you really have to get back a starter. And you especially have to get back a guy that can play in the playoffs. Who is that guy? I don't know. I don't know who's available, but I think there are some things that are going to benefit the Bucks this summer with free agency. All of this relies on Giannis, though, and what he decides. Because, as we talked about before, it is easier. I won't say easy, but it is easier to get players to come to Milwaukee, to get players to take things like a veteran minimum contract when they know their teammate is Giannis Antetokounmpo. And the moment that changes is the moment Milwaukee is no longer that destination, unless you are the team that suddenly has cap room in a landscape where there are not many teams. There are not many teams with cap room. That is not going to be the case this summer. And that's one of the big changes. And look, frankly, even if Giannis is here, and if we start to take an assessment of this group and say, well, best case scenario is probably where you finished again this year. When you look at what the Cleveland Cavaliers have assembled, when you look at the Indiana Pacers and you look at other teams, what happens if the Orlando Magic find some offense in the offseason? What if the Celtics stay the same? What the Knicks and what they've done? So it's starting to get very challenging. And that's the other reality is, look, even if you got Giannis, maybe this isn't quite as much of a destination. Not maybe. It probably isn't quite as much of a destination when these other teams are starting to come on now. So there are things that are going to benefit you. As I said, we'll get to those coming up in just a moment here. But it's the learnings that you need to take are how these teams played you. Because while the Indiana Pacers are very unique in their offensive tempo and the way that they play on both ends of the floor, it's not that they're radically different from what we're starting to see seep in as the way to play in the league these days. And the Bucks are one of the teams that has gotten further and further removed from that these past few years. They have been the relic of the era before the second apron and the era before three-pointers really exploded. I mean, I know this has been a three-point heavy league, but the way it has really expanded, and the Boston Celtics taking 100 3-pointers in the first two games of the Eastern Conference semifinals, it's not so much big for the offense. It's big for the defense and what it means there and how you have to defend all areas of the floor rather just taking away those shots around the rim. So that's one of the bigger radical changes that the Bucks have to, you would think, lean into here in this offseason. But as I said, there is some good news for the Bucks. How much that carries over and just how good that news is remains to be seen, but there is some good news when it comes to the free agency front and players that they hope to retain. So we'll open up that conversation and a couple other things that stood out in that Pacers series and what we're seeing across the league here in the playoffs coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you about our friends over at DoorDash. As we all know what time it is. Playoff season means big performances and even bigger rewards. DoorDash is bringing the heat with a slam dunk deal for Dash Pass members during the 2025 NBA playoffs. It's called They Swoosh, You Score. So anytime a player drops 50 or more points in a playoff game, Dash Pass members score a free 3-piece crispy tenders combo from Wingstop the very next day. Just place an order of $20 or more. Use the code WINGSTOP50 at checkout, and that combo is yours. Crispy, delicious, and totally free. Offer valid noon to midnight the day after the game. Terms apply. So here's the play. Sign up for Dash Pass to unlock this and more exclusive deals all season long. When any player scores 50 or more in a playoff game, Dash Pass members can grab a free 3-piece crispy tenders combo from Wingstop the next day with a 20 or more order, $20 or more order, and the code WINGSTOP50. That is dash pass your door to more savings, more flavor, and more ways to win. Terms apply. Okay, so a couple of things that stood out about the Indiana Pacers and what I think you're really going to see more and more of is the way they pressure the ball. Two things, really: the way they pressure the ball and the way that they have multiple ball handlers on the floor. Their starting backcourt, especially when you think about where this all clicked and changed for the Indiana Pacers. Obviously, more time with Pascal Siakam after that trade was made a season ago. Late January that they made that trade. More time, more familiarity. The pieces fit right, but the Buddy Hield trade, trading Buddy Hield, and in turn moving him out of your starting lineup and moving Andrew Nembhard into your starting lineup, who we have seen become a playoff riser, not just this playoffs, last year as well. A two-way player at that too. But Andrew Nembhard is a point guard at heart, and so is Tyrese Halliburton. So they have two guys with size that could play the two guard that are both point guards. So they have two ball handlers, pure ball handlers, not just guys that, well, this guy can get the ball across midcourt. Two actual point guards that can handle the ball, beat a press, initiate an offense. So putting more of those types on the floor, and think about how many times we have complained about that through the years for the Bucks, especially against the Indiana Pacers, and the inability to beat that press. And that press, too, to recognize, make it difficult on teams, right? Make it difficult for teams to get up the floor, make it difficult for teams to get into their sets, make them take time to get into those sets, to scramble down the stretch and not give those clean looks. And it's easier said than done, because it's not as simple as, hey guys, we got to try to defend the inbounds pass now. You need the right guys to do it, and you need a lot of things to fall into place. You need to be coached to do so. You need to be executing that as well, and that's something that the Indiana Pacers have done. We mentioned on the show the other day, the biggest model to take from the Pacers, and if you told me there's one thing you can pull from them to do, it's, okay, well, just win on the margins like Indiana does. Things like that, things like getting out and creating fast break opportunities, running on makes that up and down. When you think about the hustle stats in the stat sheet, Indiana's winning that more often than not. And one of the challenges with this construction of the Bucks roster I mentioned is it's felt like it's been a relic of the past when you think about how you could play and how much the game has really changed. And I know 3-point shooting, as I mentioned in the last segment, has been here for a while now, and it's going to continue to be here. But I think what we discount a lot of times, or don't quite take into account with that shooting, is you just think about your team and offensively what your team has to do. Okay, just get guys that can shoot. Get guys that we think are proven playoff shooters. Get guys that are good at the catch and shoot. But the reality is, it just means you need even more two-way players. The two-way play is even more, not even valuable, vital than ever before, because you have to be able to defend the perimeter. You need more island defense. In other words, you're out there by yourself. We're not going to switch. We're not going to fall into those traps. We want guys that can hold up on the perimeter and that can get to those assignments and make it difficult for you to get up those shots. That's what you're starting to see more and more of in the league, and that is not a way the Bucks could have played with the way that their roster was constructed the past few years. I've mentioned the atrophy that you'd seen from that roster year over year over year when you think about the injuries that piled up for a player like Chris Middleton, the age for all these players, guys that started to leave, the trade that brought in Damian Lillard that so far has not worked out. I think one of the other things attached to that too is you do have to wonder, what if I were to tell you, Jon Horst, a day before you make that trade, hey, 4 months from now, the league is going to reevaluate how they officiate things, and they're going to allow you to be much more physical defensively, and they're going to swallow the whistle on a lot of things. You sure you want to do this? You sure you don't want to lean into this group that you have right now, or at least this guy that you have in Drew Holiday? And we will never know the answer to that, but that is a fascinating what if to toss out there. But, the other thing is, it's tough to find these situations where you trade a franchise player and it works out not only immediately, but it works out, period, to the level that the Bucks frankly need it to work out to. And ironically enough, I think two of the teams that you could think about here, or one of the teams, is the Indiana Pacers, and it involves the same guy being traded twice. But you think about that Paul George trade way back when he goes to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and how Paul George, who is nowhere near the level of Giannis Antetokounmpo, Paul George represents the two trades that yielded the biggest dividends in recent memory here. That trade to the Thunder, where the Pacers get back Victor Oladipo and Domas Sabonis, and what they eventually turn those guys into. That Oladipo trade, it's like trading the paperclip to get a house. It eventually got you Andrew Nembhard and a few other players. Ben Shepherd. You get a draft pick that becomes Ben Shepherd. It eventually gets you Bruce Brown, not Bruce Brown, you signed him, but eventually gets you Pascal Siakam because of that draft pick that you got and attaching that to Bruce Brown in that trade. And Domas Sabonis obviously eventually gets you Tyrese Halliburton. So that's one that really paid off. And then, as I mentioned, Paul George is in there twice, because then a couple of years later, the Oklahoma City Thunder do the exact same thing and trade Paul George to the Clippers and get this guy who in all likelihood is going to win the MVP this season. It's not to say that's the only two times it's ever happened, but that's the challenge, is who is the guy you're going to get? If this is in fact something the Bucks explore, what do those picks mean? Because it's easy to trade for draft picks. The intrigue that's out there when you see first round pick in this year. We don't know who that player is. We don't know what that pick is because of the lottery. And I think it's easy to fall in love with the idea of draft picks. It's also funny that all the critiques and criticisms that we hear for Jon Horst, the solution is you want the Bucks to acquire more draft picks. But it hasn't worked out a lot of times recently on either end, but especially for that player jumping to a new team. And I don't think this is a coping. I do wonder if that becomes, and again, I'm not suggesting, well, Giannis is really leaning towards a trade or Giannis is evaluating his future, but you do wonder if that is taken into serious account and consideration of, look at all these other trades of guys that have jumped to other situations that haven't really worked out. I mean, we just named Paul George again. Paul George isn't to the level of Giannis. Paul George isn't to the level of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander right now. But the James Harden trades, plural. A disaster in Brooklyn. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons that went into that with all three of those guys. The Kevin Durant trade to the Phoenix Suns did not work out. The Damian Lillard trade, as we mentioned so far, has not worked out. One by one, it's becoming more and more of a tougher fit for guys to find things that really line up and work for them. And especially with this CBA, that it's made things much more difficult to assemble those types of teams. It's really looking at the way teams are constructed. The Indiana Pacers, there's not a superstar on that team. There's some very good players in Tyrese Halliburton, Pascal Siakam, right? All the other guys that we talked about, they're role players as well. Not a superstar, but that is what we're starting to see is more and more important. The Oklahoma City Thunder, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a superstar. You got very good role players around him. Denver Nuggets, Nikola Jokić is a superstar. Jamal Murray had a terrific run to the finals in a championship 2 years ago. Jamal Murray is a very good player, but nobody's going to call Jamal Murray a superstar. And you're seeing that's the construction. For cap reasons, but also for basketball fit. You need one superstar, a very good player, and just solid guys around them. And there is a path forward to that for the Bucks. May not be next year. It may be 2 years from now, maybe 3 years from now. Who knows? But there is a path forward to that. And as I mentioned, I think there are some things that are going to help out the Bucks as well when we talk about their free agents this summer. So we'll take a look at why that is and what that is coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, did you know your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe, or sign into Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Avowed as easily as you stream your favorite TV shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. With Wi-Fi 6 and auto low latency mode advanced technology, Fire TV Stick 4K delivers smoother, more responsive gameplay with lightning fast speeds you'll need to stay competitive. And if you play high quality Xbox games at a fraction of the cost than you could on a console. Already have a console, a Fire TV Stick 4K device is more affordable and it's easier to travel with, allowing you to take yours or your kids' games with you wherever you go and just plug and play. Head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K, Fire TV Stick 4K Max, and Fire TV Cube. Okay, so I cannot stress this enough. I'm not saying the Bucks are in a good spot when we look at the offseason that's coming up here. They are in a much better spot than they would have been had they not made that Chris Middleton trade. And this is not to relitigate that deal. I'm sure there's still a lot of people that are not convinced of that, especially when you look at the performance you got from Kyle Kuzma down the stretch and certainly in the playoffs. And again, look, Doc Rivers himself pointed out, not where we needed him to be. Was not the performance we needed from Kyle Kuzma, but we think he'll be better next year. The big thing is, even if Kyle Kuzma is not better, and even if that's the version of Kyle Kuzma you get going forward, that trade pulled you out of the second apron. And all the things that Camille and I talked about, and we will get into in much greater detail with Frank in the next couple of days here as we really start to dig into the offseason. None of those things are an option, right? Even a taxpayer mid-level, not an option. All you could do, taking back more money in a trade, using that trade exception isn't there without that Chris Middleton trade. So you're in the same spot of, once again, all we can do is sign guys to veteran minimum contracts. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. 2 years ago, it did not work. This past year, you were 2 out of 3. You know, as many complaints and as much as you may not have liked the performance of Taurean Prince in the postseason, Taurean Prince gave you a very solid season of work. And Taurean Prince, I think, was exactly who he should have been for a player on a veteran minimum. You got Gary Trent Jr. on a veteran minimum. You can make a strong case Gary Trent Jr. should not have been on a veteran minimum, but that's part of where we're at with the league. And that's where I mentioned the Bucks may be getting some help here, or they're not quite in all that bad of a spot when people fret over, well, can they retain this guy or can they retain this guy? Listening to a few people who I do trust talk about the free agents that are out there on the market and some of the names that are out there that are going to command a lot of interest, that play key positions in those areas that we just mentioned, how you need to play if you're the Bucks, the style of play you need to get into, the two-way guys. There are a decent amount of viable options. Taurean Prince and Gary Trent Jr. and really Gary Trent Jr., because we haven't mentioned the name of Taurean Prince all that much in terms of Bucks offseason needs. But Gary Trent Jr. is not the number one guy on the market in terms of, you know, free agent shooting guards. There are a couple guys in front of him. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is probably the number one guy out there. Who knows what happens with Fred VanVleet? So he's not going to be the number one guy or number one target at that spot. And why that becomes important is one by one, as you start to go through the list of free agents that are out there, you look at this summer, for example. I mentioned shooting guards. Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Quentin Grimes is a restricted free agent. Cam Thomas is a restricted free agent. DeAnthony Melton, who suffered that ACL injury very early in the season. You would assume it's going to take a little bit of time, but he's going to return early in the season. He's 27 years old. DeAnthony Melton is a free agent. Malik Beasley is a free agent. Gary Trent Jr. you got out there. Karis LeVert is a free agent. Sam Merrill is a free agent. Even Tim Hardaway Jr. So there's a lot of guys that are out there that can at least give you valuable minutes. Alec Burks, another one. Amir Coffey, who we saw really start to excel with the Los Angeles Clippers. So you start to pile up all these guys. And Fred VanVleet, if we want to put him at a 2-guard or a point guard, right? You start to pile up all these guys. Malcolm Brogdon, not to get too sidetracked, another interesting one. You start to get all these guys out there. And you start to look at the cap situation for a lot of teams. And as we mentioned, there's only a handful of teams that have cap space. You got the Brooklyn Nets who have $67 million, nearly $70 million in cap space. The Hawks have $1 million in cap space, but the Pistons, $20 million. The Rockets, $12 million. The Grizzlies, $7 million. That is it for teams with caps. The Mavericks, $6 million as well. That's it for the cap space. Why this is important is that list that we just mentioned. There's not a lot of teams. So those are the cap space teams. The mid-level exception teams, a little bit more than that. But there's not a lot that's out there. And remember, you're hard capped at the first apron if you use all of your mid-level exception on a player. So there's other teams that look at that and say, well, there's other moves we have to do that are not going to be possible if we give all this money to this player. That's why from the start, I know I said it, I know Frank said it, and we got a little bit of pushback. I never believed the mid-level exception was a target for a guy like Gary Trent Jr., for a guy like Kevin Porter Jr. The reality is you're splitting it up, and maybe it's going to take a Malik Beasley figure. I don't know that it's going to take that much for a player like Kevin Porter Jr. I'm still not sure what the market is for Gary Trent Jr. It's certainly more than the veteran minimum, but again, maybe it is Malik Beasley, where we're talking about $6 million that he took with the Pistons this past year. Maybe it's something like the room exception, where we're talking about $4 or $5 million. But the point is, it's not only there's not a lot of teams with cap space to sign players, there's not a lot of teams that have the mid-level exception to throw out there. So once that starts to happen, that's how you get players like Gary Trent Jr. to sign to the veteran minimum. I don't think that's going to be the case again this summer, but I don't think the Bucks are out there bidding against a handful of teams, or a large number, I should say. It will be a handful, a large number of teams for the services of Gary Trent Jr. So that is certainly something to keep an eye on. The restricted free agency for Ryan Rollins, as we start to get more intel on that, that's going to be an interesting thing. And maybe the most interesting thing is just what is the market for players like Bobby Portis? That certainly ties into that as well. And Gary Trent Jr. So what does that mean for the Bucks restricted free agents this summer? Those are the questions I don't have the answers for. And we're not going to have those answers until we get to probably a month from now, once you start to get closer and closer to free agents here. But that's the big takeaway for now. It sucks to lose in the first round. I get it. I would love to be working right now. It's not fun. It's disappointing. And I get what this does, the feeling it gives you of what does this mean for Giannis. But I can assure you, if the Bucks did not make that trade that brought in Kyle Kuzma and sent out Chris Middleton, if you didn't make that trade and all this other stuff happened, Damian Lillard still gets injured, you still lose in the first round, they're in big trouble. So it's not great, but it could be much, much worse. By the way, the Minnesota Timberwolves won. I would assume a lot of Bucks fans have jumped on the Timberwolves train to root for that team. If it can't be us, why not our neighbors to the north, and let's root for the Timberwolves. So that series is even up at a game apiece now. Only one game on the Thursday night schedule. You got 2 more tomorrow. We'll see if the Indiana Pacers can go up 3-0 as the series moves back to Indy, or moves to Indy, I should say. And then game 3 between the Denver Nuggets and Oklahoma City Thunder. That game is in Denver. And speaking of game 3s, Saturday afternoon, the Knicks and the Boston Celtics, game 3 of that series. So look, a lot to pour through here, and a lot of reading between the lines, a lot of tea leaves to be read here in this offseason, and see what we start to learn in these coming days about what's the direction this team is going to move in. Because if history is any indicator here, Jon Horst has always worked on something creative to try to upgrade that roster. And again, now you got at least more things you can do this summer than you would have if you didn't make that trade. That'll do it for today's solo show. So thanks to everybody for sitting through this here today on this Friday morning. We'll be back next week, and I believe we'll have Frank on early in the week to get his thoughts on Game 5, the end of the season, and then we'll eventually start to dig into some of the things we just mentioned here today, the cap and the spots that the Bucks are in, some of the things they can do, all the things that bore some of you to tears of what hard caps you at the first apron, what is a biannual exception, what's the room exception, and things of that. We'll get all those answers from Frank coming up on next week's show. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll talk to you once again next week on Locked On Bucks.